Victoria Blackwood stood at the window of her Manhattan penthouse, her manicured fingers wrapped around a crystal glass of Chardonnay as she watched the city lights flicker beneath the evening sky. The wedding invitation lay on her desk, its elegant calligraphy mocking her with every glance. Her son, Alexander Blackwood III, was about to marry a public school teacher, a thought that made her perfectly arranged world crack at its foundations. "I won't allow it," she whispered to herself, her voice carrying the weight of generations of carefully curated social standing. The Blackwoods didn't just have money. They had legacy, influence, and most importantly, standards. And Sarah Mitchell, with her modest salary and discount store clothes, fell devastatingly short of those standards. Victoria took another sip of wine, remembering the moment Alexander had introduced Sarah at the country club 3 months ago. The girl had worn a simple blue dress that practically screamed department store clearance. And when asked about her profession, she'd spoken about teaching at PS, 118, with an enthusiasm that made Victoria's skin crawl. It wasn't just about the money, though God knew the girl probably made less in a year than Victoria spent on handbags. It was about class, about understanding the world they lived in. Taking a decisive breath, Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "James, I need you to do some digging on Sarah Mitchell. Everything. Background, finances, family history. Leave no stone unturned." She paused, listening to her private investigator's response. "Yes, it's urgent. My son seems to have lost his mind, and I need ammunition to bring him back to his senses." As she ended the call, Victoria's mind was already racing with possibilities. She'd raised Alexander in the finest schools, surrounded him with the right people, groomed him to take over the family's investment firm. She wouldn't let some public school teacher with a bleeding heart derail everything she'd worked for. The next morning, Victoria arrived at Blackwood Investments earlier than usual. The security guard nodded respectfully as she strode through the lobby, her Louboutins clicking against the marble floor. She found Alexander in his office, already buried in paperwork. "Mother," he said without looking up, "this is an unexpected surprise." Victoria closed the door behind her, noting how her son's shoulders tensed at the sound. "We need to talk about this situation with Sarah." Alexander finally looked up, his blue eyes, so like his late father's, hardening. "Her name is Sarah, not this situation, and we're getting married in 3 months." "Don't be absurd," Victoria said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "You're the heir to Blackwood Investments. Do you have any idea what marrying someone like her would do to our reputation, to our standing in the community?" "Someone like her?" Alexander's voice took on a dangerous edge. "You mean someone who dedicates her life to teaching children? Someone who makes a real difference in the world instead of just accumulating wealth?" Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be naive. The world runs on money and connections, not good intentions. If she really cared about making a difference, she'd be smart enough to marry into money first." "I'm marrying her, Mother. Nothing you say will change that." Victoria stood, smoothing her Chanel suit. "We'll see about that." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. "Did you know your precious Sarah has been lying to you?" Alexander's expression flickered. "What are you talking about?" "She's been hiding something rather significant." Victoria placed the folder on his desk. "Take a look at her bank statements. Every month, like clockwork, she withdraws almost her entire salary in cash. What do you suppose she's doing with all that money? Drugs, gambling, or perhaps she's not as noble as she pretends to be." She watched with satisfaction as Alexander opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. The seed of doubt had been planted. Victoria knew her son. Once he started questioning Sarah's integrity, everything else would unravel. "I'll have James continue his investigation," Victoria said, moving toward the door. "In the meantime, perhaps you should ask your fiancée what she's really doing with all that money. After all, a marriage should be built on trust, shouldn't it?" As she left his office, Victoria allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. She'd make Alexander see reason one way or another. The Blackwood name and legacy were at stake, and she'd do whatever it took to protect them. What Victoria didn't know was that her investigation into Sarah Mitchell's finances would uncover something far more shocking than she anticipated, a truth that would shake her perfectly ordered world to its core and force her to question everything she thought she knew about wealth, worth, and the true meaning of legacy. That evening, as Victoria prepared for the charity gala she was hosting, her phone buzzed with a message from James. "Found something interesting about Sarah Mitchell. You need to see this in person. It's not what we thought." Victoria frowned at the cryptic message. What could be so important that James couldn't share it over the phone? She typed a quick response. "Tomorrow morning, my office, 8 a.m. She put down her phone and walked to her dressing room mirror, adjusting her diamond necklace. Whatever James had discovered, she was certain it would help her cause. After all, people like Sarah Mitchell always had something to hide. Victoria had built her life on that certainty, on the knowledge that money and social status were the only true measures of worth. Little did she know, the next morning would bring a revelation that would make her question every value she held dear, every judgment she'd ever made, and most importantly, her own place in the world. She thought she understood so well. Want to discover what Victoria finds out about Sarah? Keep watching. This story will change how you see wealth and success forever. Victoria arrived at her office precisely at 8 a.m. the next morning, her mind still churning with possibilities about what James had discovered. The private investigator was already waiting, his weathered face unusually serious as he clutched a thick manila envelope. "This better be worth my time," Victoria said, settling behind her mahogany desk. "What did you find?" James cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've been your investigator for 15 years. I've uncovered corporate scandals, political bribes, and countless affairs, but I've never seen anything quite like this." He opened the envelope and spread out a series of photographs across her desk. Victoria leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails pressing against the glossy surfaces. The images showed Sarah in various locations around the city's poorest neighborhoods, but it was what she was doing that made Victoria's breath catch. In one photo, Sarah was helping a young boy with what appeared to be homework, surrounded by stacks of new textbooks. In another, she was carrying bags of groceries into a run-down apartment building. A third showed her handing an envelope to an elderly woman who was crying with gratitude. "I don't understand," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Mitchell donates almost her entire salary to help her students and their families," James explained. "She lives in a tiny studio apartment and works part-time at a bookstore on weekends to cover her own basic expenses. Everything else, and I mean everything, goes to helping others." Victoria's hands trembled as she picked up more photographs. "But why? Why would anyone choose to live like that when they could?" "There's more," James interrupted, pulling out a stack of documents. "I traced her background. Sarah Mitchell comes from old money, very old money. Her grandfather was Richard Mitchell of the Boston Mitchells." Victoria's head snapped up. The Boston Mitchells were legendary in East Coast society, known for both their wealth and their fierce privacy. They'd largely disappeared from the social scene decades ago, and rumors had swirled about what had happened to their fortune. "That's impossible," Victoria breathed. "If she's a Mitchell, why is she living like someone who cares more about helping others than maintaining appearances?" James finished quietly. "According to my sources, Sarah inherited a trust fund worth over $50 million when she turned 25. She immediately set up an anonymous foundation that funds educational programs in underprivileged communities. She's never touched a penny of it for herself." Victoria sank back in her chair, her worldview cracking like fine china dropped on marble. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just some poor teacher trying to social climb by marrying Alexander. She was someone who had willingly walked away from the very world Victoria had spent her life desperately trying to maintain. "There's one more thing you should see," James said, pulling out a final document. "This is a copy of a letter Sarah wrote to her grandmother last month. I I probably shouldn't share personal correspondence, but I think you need to read it." Victoria's hands shook as she took the paper. "Dearest Grandma, I know you worry about me, but please understand that I've never been happier. Every day I see the difference we can make in these children's lives. Last week, little Maria, remember the girl I told you about? Her mother finally got the operation she needed, thanks to our emergency medical fund. Maria's smile when she told me her mom was coming home. That's worth more than all the trust funds in the world. And now, something wonderful has happened. I've met someone who sees me for who I am, not what I was born into. Alexander is kind, genuine, and believes in making a real difference in the world. When I told him about my work with the students, he didn't question why I would waste my time with public school kids. He asked how he could help. I haven't told him about my background yet. I need to know he loves Sarah the teacher, not Sarah the Mitchell heiress. But Grandma, I think he's the one. He has such a good heart, despite his mother's attempts to turn him into something he's not. Speaking of Victoria Blackwood, she reminds me so much of what Mother became toward the end. So focused on appearances and social standing that she forgot how to see the real value in people. It breaks my heart to watch her try to mold Alexander into that world, just as it broke my heart to watch Mother slowly lose herself to it. But I haven't given up hope. Sometimes the people most trapped by wealth are the ones most desperately in need of discovering what truly matters. All my love, Sarah. Victoria set the letter down, her vision blurring. She thought of her own mother, of the endless society parties and cutting remarks about those who didn't measure up. She thought of how she'd followed that example, believing it was the only way to protect her family's legacy. "Mrs. Blackwood?" James's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" She stood abruptly, turning to face the window. The city sprawled below, and for the first time she found herself wondering about the lives being lived in those less prestigious neighborhoods she'd always ignored. "That will be all, James," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Send me your invoice." After he left, Victoria remained at the window, her carefully constructed world shifting beneath her feet. She thought of all the times she'd dismissed people as beneath her, all the judgments she'd made based on bank accounts and social connections. She thought of Sarah, living in a tiny apartment while helping others, finding joy in something beyond material wealth. But most devastatingly, she thought of Alexander, her beloved son whom she'd tried so hard to shape in her image. Had she been protecting him, as she'd always believed? Or had she been slowly suffocating the very qualities that had drawn him to someone like Sarah? Her phone buzzed. Alexander was calling. Victoria stared at the screen, knowing this conversation would change everything. The question was she ready to change with it? What she didn't realize was that her next decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform her relationship with her son, but would force her to confront the deepest wounds in her own past, wounds that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. Hit subscribe now to never miss stories that touch your heart. You won't believe what Victoria does next. Victoria's finger hovered over her phone's screen as Alexander's call continued to ring. Finally, she answered, her voice carefully controlled. "Alexander, darling." "Mother." His tone was clipped, professional. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about Sarah's finances." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she now knew. "Alexander, I asked her about it," he interrupted. "Do you know what she told me? She showed me everything. Receipts, records, photographs of the families she helps. She's been using her salary to support her students' families, buying them books, food, even helping with medical bills." "I know," Victoria whispered. "What?" "I know, Alexander. I found out this morning." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Alexander spoke again, his voice was harder than she'd ever heard it. "So this was your plan? Dig up dirt on Sarah? Try to prove she was hiding something nefarious? Did it ever occur to you that someone might actually be good, Mother? That not everyone is obsessed with money and status like you?" Each word hit Victoria like a physical blow. "Alexander, please, can you come to the house tonight? There's something we need to discuss. I don't think—" "Please," she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "It's important." After another long pause, Alexander sighed. "Fine." 7 o'clock. The line went dead, and Victoria sank into her chair. Her eyes fell on an old photograph on her desk. She and Alexander at his college graduation, both smiling perfectly practiced smiles. Had they ever really smiled genuinely at each other? Had she ever allowed herself, or him, that freedom? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Victoria cancelled her appointments, ignored calls from her social circle, and spent hours lost in thought. By the time 7 o'clock approached, she had poured herself 3 glasses of wine, but hadn't touched any of them. The doorman announced Alexander's arrival, and Victoria straightened her spine, smoothing her silk blouse with trembling hands. When he stepped into her living room, she was struck by how much he looked like his father. The same proud bearing, the same intensity in his eyes. "All right, Mother," he said, remaining standing. "What was so important?" Victoria gestured to the sofa. "Please sit. There's something I need to tell you about your father." Alexander's expression flickered with surprise, but he sat. Victoria rarely spoke about her late husband, preferring to keep those memories and the pain they carried safely locked away. "Your father," she began, her voice soft, "wasn't born into wealth. Did you know that?" Alexander shook his head slowly. "He was a scholarship student at Yale, brilliant but poor. When we met, I was already established in society, already trapped in this world of expectations and appearances." Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. "My mother was horrified when we started dating. She did everything she could to break us up. Investigations, bribes, threats. Sound familiar?" She gave a bitter laugh. "I defied her, married him anyway. We were so in love, so sure we could face anything together. But slowly, year by year, this world changed him, changed us. He became obsessed with proving himself, with showing everyone he belonged. The kind, passionate man I fell in love with disappeared into board meetings and profit margins." Victoria stood, walking to the window, her usual refuge. "The night before he died, we had a terrible fight. He wanted to sell his father's old repair shop to make room for a luxury development. It was the last connection to his past, to who he really was. But all he could see was the profit potential. I supported him, of course. I always supported his transformation into what I thought he should be." She turned back to Alexander, tears now flowing freely. "The next morning, he had his heart attack. The doctors said it was stress, overwork. But I knew we had killed him. Not just physically, but spiritually. We had destroyed everything that made him wonderful, replaced it with this hollow pursuit of more." Alexander sat in stunned silence, watching his always composed mother break down before him. "When I saw Sarah's bank statements," Victoria continued, "I thought I was protecting you, but this morning I learned who she really is. Did you know she's a Mitchell, from the Boston Mitchells?" Alexander's eyes widened. "What? No, that's not possible. Sarah lives in a tiny apartment. She shops at Target. She chose that life," Victoria interrupted. "She has millions at her disposal, but she chose to live simply so she could help others. She chose love over money, compassion over status, just like your father once did, before I, helped destroy that part of him." Victoria moved to sit beside her son, taking his hand in hers. "I read a letter she wrote to her grandmother. She said I remind her of her mother, someone so trapped by wealth that she forgot how to see real value in people. And she's right. I've spent so many years measuring worth in dollars that I almost made the same mistake with you that my mother made with me, that I made with your father." Alexander's hand tightened around hers. "Mother, I'm sorry," Victoria whispered, the words feeling both foreign and desperately necessary. "I'm so sorry, Alexander. She's exactly who you need, who we all need. She sees the truth I forgot long ago, that real wealth isn't in our bank accounts or social connections. It's in how many lives we touch, how much love we share." She reached into her bag and pulled out copies of the photos James had taken. Look at what she does with her money. Look at the lives she changes. While I've been hosting charity galas to see and be seen, she's been quietly making real differences in people's lives. Alexander looked through the photos, his eyes growing wet. This is why she's always so tired on weekends, he said softly. Why she never wants expensive gifts. She's been... He looked up at his mother. Why didn't she tell me about being a Mitchell? Victoria smiled sadly. Because she wanted you to love her for who she is, not what she was born into. Just like your father wanted me to love him for who he was, before I helped him become something else entirely. She stood, walking to her desk and returning with an envelope. I want you to give this to her, she said, handing it to Alexander. It's an invitation to dinner here tomorrow night, just the three of us. I need to apologize to her in person and I need to learn from her, if she's willing to teach me. Alexander took the envelope, studying his mother's face. You've really changed your mind about her. I've changed my mind about everything, Victoria replied. And it's long overdue. What Victoria didn't realize was that this dinner would become more than just an apology. It would be the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through Manhattan's highest social circles and challenge everything they thought they knew about wealth, worth, and the true meaning of legacy. If this story is moving you, subscribe now. Our channel brings you powerful stories of transformation every day. The next evening, Victoria found herself doing something she hadn't done in decades. She was cooking dinner herself. She dismissed her personal chef, ignored the protests of her housekeeper, and spent the afternoon following her grandmother's old recipes. The kitchen, usually spotless and unused, was now filled with the aroma of herbs and roasting chicken. As she chopped vegetables for the salad, her mind wandered to another kitchen, long ago, where she'd learned these recipes. Before social climbing became her religion, before appearances meant everything, back when she still knew how to create something with her own hands. The doorbell rang at precisely 7, and Victoria's heart jumped. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, another forgotten sensation, and went to answer it herself, something that made her doorman do a double take through the security camera. Sarah stood beside Alexander, wearing a simple blue dress that Victoria now recognized as a conscious choice, rather than a financial necessity. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Victoria in an apron with a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Welcome," Victoria said, stepping aside to let them in. "I hope you don't mind, but I decided to cook tonight. It's been quite a while." Sarah's surprise melted into a warm smile. "It smells wonderful, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria, please." She led them through the penthouse to the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. "I thought we might be more comfortable here." Alexander's eyebrows shot up as he took in the scene. Pots bubbling on the stove, vegetables scattered across the cutting board, and his perfectly coiffed mother looking decidedly unglamorous in the midst of it all. "Mother, I didn't even know you could cook," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. Victoria busied herself with the stove. "There's a lot you don't know about me, darling. A lot I've forgotten about myself, if I'm being honest." She turned to face them both. "Sarah, would you mind helping me with the salad? Alexander, you remember how your father always insisted on choosing the perfect wine. Why don't you select something from the cellar?" Once Alexander had disappeared downstairs, Victoria handed Sarah a knife and cutting board. They worked in silence for a moment, the rhythmic sound of chopping filling the air. "I know who you are," Victoria finally said, keeping her eyes on the vegetables. "About your family, your inheritance, your choice to live differently." Sarah's knife paused briefly before resuming its steady rhythm. "I wondered if you'd find out eventually. Why didn't you tell Alexander? Would it have mattered?" Sarah's voice was gentle. "Would knowing I came from money have made you see me differently?" "Because that's exactly what I didn't want. The money isn't who I am. It's just something I was born into, like blue eyes or curly hair." Victoria turned to study the younger woman. "You're very wise for someone so young." "Not wise," Sarah corrected. Just clear about what matters. I watched my mother lose herself to this world, just like you mentioned in your invitation. She became so obsessed with maintaining our social position that she forgot how to be happy. By the end, she couldn't even remember why she wanted any of it in the first place. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. I did the same thing to Alexander's father. I thought I was helping him succeed, but I was just erasing him. Everything wonderful about him, everything real. But you're trying to change that now, Sarah said softly. With Alexander, with yourself, because of you. Victoria set down her spoon and faced Sarah fully. You've shown me what real strength looks like. Not the strength to maintain appearances or accumulate wealth, but the strength to live authentically, to help others without expecting anything in return. Sarah shook her head. I'm not trying to be an example. I'm just trying to live in a way that lets me sleep at night. And how do you sleep in that tiny apartment when you could have so much more? Better than I ever did in my family's mansion, Sarah smiled. Last week, one of my students, a little girl named Mia, learned to read her first full sentence. Her face just lit up, like she suddenly understood she could do anything, that feeling worth more than any trust fund. Victoria felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. I want to help, she said abruptly. Help? With your work, your students, their families. I have resources, connections. I've spent years using them to maintain social status, but maybe they could do some real good. Sarah studied her for a long moment. It's not glamorous work. No galas, no recognition. Most of it is quiet behind the scenes. Good, Victoria said firmly. I think I've had enough of the spotlight. They were interrupted by Alexander's return, wine bottles in hand. He looked between them, sensing the changed atmosphere. Everything okay up here? Perfect, Victoria said, and meant it. Sarah was just agreeing to help me start a new chapter in my life. As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed naturally for the first time in Victoria's memory. They talked about Sarah's students, about Alexander's hopes for changing his father's company to focus more on community investment, about Victoria's memories of cooking with her grandmother. It wasn't until they were finishing dessert that Victoria brought up what had been weighing on her mind all evening. Sarah, I need to properly apologize, not just for investigating you, but for everything, for judging you, for trying to come between you and Alexander, for being exactly the kind of person I promised myself I'd never become. Sarah reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. You know what I tell my students, that it's never too late to learn something new, that mistakes are just opportunities to grow. Victoria squeezed her hand, tears threatening again. Then I have a lot of growing to do. We all do, Sarah said softly. That's what makes life interesting. As Victoria looked at her son and his fiancée, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. They glowed with the same kind of love she'd once shared with Alexander's father, before society's expectations had dimmed their light. But this time, she vowed, things would be different. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor who would test her newfound convictions in ways she never could have anticipated. Someone from Sarah's past, who would force all of them to confront the true price of authenticity in a world obsessed with appearances. This story isn't over. Subscribe now and join our community of storytelling lovers. Tomorrow's video will touch your heart just as deeply. The next morning, Victoria was reviewing proposals for a new educational foundation she planned to establish when her assistant buzzed through. Mrs. Blackwood, there's a Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent. Victoria's hand froze over her paperwork. Sarah's mother, the woman Sarah had described as losing herself to the social world. Send her in, Claire. Eleanor Mitchell swept into the office like a perfectly preserved artifact of old money. Her Chanel suit, perfectly coiffed silver hair, and aristocratic bearing spoke of generations of wealth and privilege. But Victoria, with her newly opened eyes, saw something else too, a brittleness, a desperate grip on control that she recognized all too well. Victoria Blackwood, Eleanor said, extending a manicured hand. I came as soon as I heard about this situation with my daughter and your son. Victoria gestured to a chair. Please sit. Would you like some tea? What I'd like, Eleanor said, remaining standing, is to understand why you're allowing this farce to continue. Surely you realize what Sarah is doing. Enlighten me. She's making a mockery of everything we stand for. Living in that terrible apartment, working at that public school, giving away money that generations of Mitchells worked to accumulate. And now she's dragging your son into her ridiculous crusade. Victoria stood slowly, remembering herself just days ago, spouting similar sentiments. What exactly do we stand for, Eleanor? Status, appearances, the careful cultivation of other people's envy. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Don't tell me she's convinced you too. The Victoria Blackwood I've heard about would never allow her son to marry someone who deliberately chooses to live like a pauper. The Victoria Blackwood you've heard about no longer exists, Victoria said quietly. Your daughter helped me see that. See what? That it's noble to throw away everything our families have built? That we should apologize for our success? Victoria moved to her window, not to hide this time, but to look out at the city with new eyes. Last night, Sarah told me about one of her students, a little girl who just learned to read her first sentence. Do you know what that feels like, Eleanor? To help someone unlock the door to their future? I know what it feels like to maintain a legacy, Eleanor snapped. To uphold standards that have defined our society for generations. Victoria turned back to face her. I killed my husband with those standards. Eleanor blinked, taken aback. Not directly, of course, Victoria continued, but I helped turn him into someone he wasn't. I made him believe that he had to prove himself worthy of our world, that who he was wasn't enough. He died trying to live up to those expectations, and I almost did the same thing to my son. She walked to her desk and picked up one of the photos James had taken. Look at your daughter, Eleanor. Really look at her. The photo showed Sarah kneeling beside a young boy, helping him with his homework. Her face was alight with joy, with purpose. When was the last time you saw Sarah look this happy? Victoria asked gently. When was the last time you felt this kind of joy yourself? Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the photo. She was always different, she whispered, always wanted to help everyone, even when she was little. I thought I was protecting her, teaching her how the world really works. But maybe she's the one who understands how the world should work. Victoria moved closer. It's not too late, Eleanor. I'm learning that it's never too late to change, to reconnect with what really matters. She won't even speak to me anymore, Eleanor said, her carefully maintained facade cracking. She says she can't bear to watch me choose status over substance, just like her father did. Then show her you can change. Come with me tomorrow. I'm visiting one of her classroom projects. See the work she's doing. Meet these children whose lives she's transforming. Eleanor sank into a chair, the photo still clutched in her hands. I don't know how to be any other way. Neither did I, Victoria said softly. But Sarah has this remarkable ability to help people find their way back to their true selves. Let her help you too. The next day, Victoria stood in the back of Sarah's classroom, watching Eleanor Mitchell experience her daughter's world for the first time. The children were presenting projects about their future dreams, becoming doctors, teachers, artists. Sarah moved among them, offering encouragement and guidance, while Eleanor watched with tears streaming down her face. During the lunch break, Victoria found Sarah in the teacher's lounge. Your mother's learning, she said. It won't be easy, but she's trying. Sarah smiled, her eyes wet, just like you did. Because of you, Victoria replied. You know, when I first met you, I thought you would destroy everything I'd built. I never imagined you'd help me build something better instead. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the garden of her Hamptons estate, watching Sarah walk down the aisle toward Alexander. The wedding was smaller than Victoria had originally planned, more intimate and authentic. Many of Sarah's students and their families were there, alongside Manhattan's elite, a blend of worlds that would have scandalized Victoria just months ago. Eleanor Mitchell stood beside her, both of them watching Sarah approach in a simple but elegant dress. "She's radiant," Eleanor whispered. "She is," Victoria agreed. "And so are you." It was true. In the past months, Eleanor had begun working with Sarah's foundation, discovering the joy of making a real difference in people's lives. The brittle society matron was softening, remembering who she'd been before status became her prison. As Alexander and Sarah exchanged vows, Victoria felt tears on her cheeks. But these weren't tears of loss or regret. They were tears of gratitude, of joy, of profound understanding that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our worst fears. At the reception, Victoria clinked her glass for attention. The gathered crowd, Manhattan socialites mingling with Sarah's students and their families, turned to listen. "When Alexander first told me he was marrying Sarah," Victoria began, "I thought my world was ending. What I didn't realize was that my world wasn't ending, it was expanding. Sarah taught me, taught all of us, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or social standing. It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we share, and the difference we make." She raised her glass. "To Sarah and Alexander, thank you for showing us that sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is having our comfortable illusions shattered. And to everyone here, may we all have the courage to choose love over appearance, substance over status, and authenticity over acceptance." As the guests applauded, Victoria caught Sarah's eye across the room. Her new daughter-in-law smiled and mouthed two words. "Thank you." Victoria smiled back, her heart full. She had lost her pride, but gained something far more precious, a true understanding of wealth, worth, and the priceless value of being real in a world of carefully constructed facades. That evening, as the celebration continued under the stars, Victoria watched her son dance with his bride, surrounded by their unique blend of guests, the wealthy and the working class, the powerful and the struggling, all brought together by love and authenticity. She realized that this was her true legacy, not the carefully maintained social position she'd once prized, but the courage to break down walls, challenge assumptions, and create something new and beautiful from the pieces of her shattered prejudices. And somewhere, she felt certain, Alexander's father was smiling down on them all, finally seeing his family become what he'd always hoped they could be: real, authentic, and truly alive. What would you have done in Victoria's position at the beginning? Would you have the courage to change everything you believed in for decades? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your perspective on these life-changing moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Look to your left. You'll find another powerful story waiting for you. Trust me, it will move you just as deeply as this one did. These moments of truth and transformation are what our channel lives for.